'Cause I wanna see you rightly. 'Cause I wanna see. 'Cause I wanna see you rightly, Jesus.
And we begin in Italy this morning, where the entire country has been put into lockdown to stem the spread of COVID-19 amid a sharp increase in cases. Now, just a few hours ago, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte extended restrictions on the movement of people in the northern provinces to the whole country. Mr. Conte says it is necessary to protect the vulnerable in the community.
È per questo che sto per firmare un provvedimento che possiamo sintetizzare con l'espressione "io resto a casa". Non ci sarà più una zona rossa, non ci sarà più 1 e la zona 2 della penisola. Ci sarà l'Italia, un'Italia zona protetta. Saranno quindi da evitare su tutto il territorio della penisola gli spostamenti, a meno che non siano motivati da 3 specifiche circostanze.
Well, so far, Italy has reported over 9,100 cases of COVID-19. That's a 24% spike versus the previous figure. And the number of deaths stands at 463, rising by 97 from the previous toll.
Well, for the latest, Seema Gupta joins us from the capital, Rome. Seema, you know, the lockdown now covers the entire country. What does that entail, and how will it impact residents and tourists?
Well, essentially, as you put it, it's all on lockdown. So that's 60 million people living in this country, all under these restrictions. You heard there from Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte that there's no longer a red zone or a second-tier zone. The entire country is a protected zone. And that means movement is severely curtailed. You can only move if you have reasons of work or absolute necessity, or if you have a health reason. Gatherings are prohibited. Schools will be closed till April 3rd, and sporting events, including Serie A football, will be stopped. No longer behind closed doors, stopped altogether. Now, he said that the habits of Italians have to change in order to protect the most fragile members of society, namely the elderly. As we've seen, they're the ones who are most affected by this COVID-19 virus. He said that the number of infections, as well as the number of patients requiring intensive care as a result of this, and unfortunately the number of deaths have risen, and it's so significant that they felt that there's no time to waste anymore. You can't adapt to these changes, he said. The changes have to come in now. And so these strong measures, he said, were necessary because they saw some irresponsible behavior. And so because of that, they've extended it to the entire countries. The movement measure is for residents here. If you're a tourist or you're here for a limited period and you are able to travel and can travel and want to travel, you can. You just have to have a certificate to explain that. And that's all that's required, even for any other kind of movement. And that essentially has been necessary as we now see COVID-19 in all 20 regions of Italy.
Good evening. Within the past couple of hours, the Italian Prime Minister has announced restrictions on movement across the entire country in the most drastic response yet to the spread of coronavirus. The measures include a ban on all public gatherings, and all schools and universities will be closed. Giuseppe Conte said the measures were necessary to defend the most fragile members of the community and he declared that the best thing for Italians to do was to stay at home. In Italy, the death toll has risen by nearly 100 in the past 24 hours, and there are more than 9,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus. Our correspondent Mark Lowen has the latest now. We join him in Bologna.
Hugh, tonight, Italy, a founding member of the EU and one of the world's most visited countries, is facing the most dramatic restrictions it has faced in peacetime. 2 days since much of the north was quarantined, coronavirus cases continue to soar. And so now the restrictions have been extended to cover the whole of the country, covering cities like here in Bologna that thought they'd escaped the worst of it.
The virus is outpacing attempts to control it. Bologna was today out of the red zone, no longer. Italy, all of it, is now under the most severe restrictions since the Second World War. Public transport will still run, but the Prime Minister has told people to stay at home, except for urgent need.
La decisione giusta oggi.
The right decision is to stay home. Our future is in our hands. We must be responsible. There will be no more red zones, no more zones 1 and 2. The entire Italy will be under protection. We will avoid movements across the entire country.
Applying for false permits to move around will be a criminal offence. Schools and universities are closed until early April. All sports matches are cancelled. Italy is now a laboratory for how to stop this virus and ease the pressure on doctors like Elena.
It's an emergency situation. I may be asked to work in a department where there's more need. We've never faced anything like this, and we're not ready.
One of Europe's best health systems is creaking under the weight, seriously short of space in intensive care. All medical staff leave has been cancelled. We got through to a doctor in quarantined Milan.
It is very difficult to forecast when we will have the breakpoint of the epidemic, the peak of the epidemic. We are near to the collapse in the most organized part of the country.
New measures to limit visiting rights caused riots in prisons today. Several inmates escaped. 7 died. A microcosm of the drastic pressure Italy is now under. The virus surging, an economy battered, and now nationwide quarantines. It's a combustible mix.
Hugh, it's still unclear how these restrictions will actually be enforced. Over the past couple of days, as we have travelled around the perimeter of the previous restriction zone, we have not seen police checkpoints. Flights have operated in and out of the country. So we wait to see tonight just how much of a shutdown this really is and whether it really can begin to contain the coronavirus outbreak.
Mark, many thanks again. Mark Lowen with the very latest there for us in the city of Bologna. Well, stock markets around the world have fallen sharply during the day, with share values marking the worst day since the financial crisis of 2008. Trading was briefly suspended in the United States because of the turbulence there. It followed a drop in oil prices, which compounded the growing economic concerns around coronavirus. Our economics editor, Faisal Islam, has this report.
The opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. The smiles didn't last. Trading having to be halted after just 4 minutes, in which time the Dow Jones index tumbled 7%, or nearly 2,000 points.
A market that's full of anxiety about the potential economic global slowdown due to the virus, which I don't even think we've seen yet, and you end up with a perfect storm. That's what we have in there today.
It was part of the knock-on effect of the global spread of coronavirus to 100 countries around the world. Global falls started in Asia, spreading to Europe, where Italian markets slumped 11% today, German markets were down 8%, and in the UK the FTSE 100 also tumbled 8%, the sharpest fall since the financial crisis a decade ago. These extraordinary moves in global stock markets matter not just because of the impact on your pensions and investments. There are impacts on government budgets and business spending too. There were also historic moves in connected markets such as oil and in government borrowing too. And all this is because of what it reveals right now. Understandable uncertainty about outbreak of the virus, but unpredicted consequences of how nations respond economically and diplomatically. Today's moves were triggered by a collapse in oil prices after top oil producers Saudi Arabia and Russia fell out over the impact of the virus, leading to slumping demand for oil. Both are now pumping crude into the market. President Trump blamed that spat and the fake news for the sharp drops, adding it was good news for consumers filling up their cars. But today's fall does suggest a scepticism that world leaders have got a grip of the crisis.
Markets don't have much confidence that governments and central banks are going to be able to support the economy through this coronavirus epidemic. I think there's a worry that central banks don't have too much scope to cut interest rates, and there's a concern that governments will be too slow to stimulate the economy.
This is not just a trading panic. The market's asking big questions about not only the speed and effectiveness of efforts to contain the virus and its economic impact, but also uncomfortable trade-offs between the two. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
Well, earlier this evening, Israel announced that all travellers entering the country would be required to quarantine themselves for 2 weeks to try to limit the spread of coronavirus. The Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, said that it was a difficult decision, but the measure was essential to safeguard public health, he said, and the decision will apply to foreign citizens from Thursday. Here in the UK, a fifth person has died of coronavirus on the day the government outlined the latest stage of its response to the crisis. The chief medical advisor for England warned that anyone showing even minor signs of respiratory tract infections or a fever will soon be told to isolate themselves for 7 days. It's the next stage of tackling the outbreak, which is set to spread in a significant way within the coming fortnight. As of today, there were 319 confirmed cases in the UK. Almost 25,000 people have been tested so far. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, has the latest.
Tonight's message from Downing Street: events may be moving fast, but they're taking their time, working out the right types of intervention to be used to try to stem the tide of the coronavirus.
While it's absolutely critical in managing the spread of this virus, that we take the right decisions at the right time based on the latest and best evidence. So we mustn't do things which have no or limited medical benefit, nor things which could turn out actually to be counterproductive.
But officials announced one significant change to advice likely in the near future.
We are now very close to the time, probably within the next 10 to 14 days, when the modelling would imply we should move to a situation where we say everybody who has even minor respiratory tract infections or a fever should be self-isolating for 7 days afterwards.
2 more patients in the UK have died with the coronavirus, one in their 70s at New Cross Hospital, part of the Royal Wolverhampton Trust, the other an individual at the Epsom and St Helier Trust. Both had underlying health problems. Elsewhere in Europe, Italy faces a huge challenge, with the whole country now effectively under quarantine. But other countries have seen a surge in case numbers. In France, there have been more than 1,200, with 19 deaths. There's now a ban on all gatherings of more than 1,000 people. In Germany, case numbers are above 1,100 and 2 have died. The government's also considering stopping large public events. Spain has seen nearly 980 cases and 25 deaths. Madrid's authorities have closed schools and universities for 2 weeks. One expert told me she thought the UK's response, without any such bans or closures, was well judged so far, but the European figures could be a sign of troubled times ahead.
These are countries that we would anticipate as being able to contain a virus like this, or at least this kind of spread of infection. So it is concerning that they've struggled to do it, and I think it suggests that once there is the development of ongoing person-to-person transmission within a country, it becomes much harder to stem the tide of this infection.
Off the Californian coast, a cruise ship carrying some people who've tested positive for the virus headed for port. The mood of more than 140 British passengers and crew was much improved. They've been told they'll be tested, and if there are no symptoms, will be allowed to board a special flight set to get them back to the UK on Wednesday. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, a number of major sporting events have now been postponed because of the virus. France has called off its Six Nations rugby match against Ireland in Paris, and Italy has postponed its game against England in Rome. But most sporting events here in the UK are still going on for now, including one of the highlights of the racing calendar, the Cheltenham Festival, which starts tomorrow. Let's join our sports editor, Dan Rowan, who's there for us. And Dan, what's the latest thinking there?
Well, Hugh, 60,000 race fans are expected to come through these gates for the first day of the festival tomorrow, and as many as almost 250,000 across the next 4 days. Cheltenham is on, and that's because the government has made clear today that according to their medical advice, there's still no reason why large-scale sports events should be closed or cancelled. But of course, elsewhere, sport is being badly affected. In the US, a major tennis tournament was cancelled overnight. The third Six Nations match of this season's tournament was today postponed. And across Italy, all sport has been suspended this evening. And of course, inevitably, that has raised questions as to whether it's right here in Britain for sport to continue as normal. Now, today, sports bodies and broadcasters were summoned to a meeting and told to ready themselves for sport to be ordered to go behind closed doors. But I think it's fair to say the government are concerned on two levels. One, that it may cause financial ruin for many sports clubs, especially in the Football League and also in rugby as well. And secondly, that it could be counterproductive if all it does is drive fans to enclosed spaces like pubs where the virus could spread just as bad, if not worse. So this is a very difficult decision, but there's a sense it's coming, and it's not a matter of if, but now when.
Dan, many thanks again for the latest there in Cheltenham. Dan Rowan, our sports editor. Well, with me is our health editor, Hugh Pym. We heard from him earlier in the report there. Can we talk about the advice that was given today, Hugh, and the kind of change in advice and the change of tone as well, really? How significant was that?
Well, Hugh, potentially significant. Right now, the position is only if you come back from one of the worst affected countries on the list and develop symptoms, do you then self-isolate and contact 111. Now, Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Advisor, has said within a couple of weeks, it's very probable we'll move to a different set of guidelines for anybody with these symptoms, no matter where they've been, for example, a dry cough, a cold, a temperature, to go and self-isolate. Now, that change, I think, is significant because it's saying that they expect coronavirus cases to carry on rising, seasonal flu to fall away. So you might as well get everyone to self-isolate for 7 days after the first appearance of these symptoms.
Tonight, obviously, we've been talking about Italy and the drastic measures announced there by the Prime Minister earlier this evening. Boris Johnson was asked very pointedly earlier today, you know, there are countries taking very, very rigorous measures. Why aren't we? Now, what is the answer they're giving you to that?
Well, very dramatic move in Italy. The British government position is, and of course there are far fewer cases here so far, is that different countries will do this in different ways. Right now they're weighing up the social cost of big interventions and the timing. There's no point going too early with bans. You can't then take it off the table if it doesn't work to begin with and you lose public confidence. So they're weighing all that up, but I do sense that we're not that far off from some sort of announcements of interventions to try to stem the growth of this virus.
Hugh, once again, thanks very much. Hugh Pym, our health editor there. Well, as the international community struggles to contain the spread of coronavirus, the World Health Organization has praised China for its response, suggesting it offers a model for others to follow. But inside China, there's anger over the way that the authorities have handled the outbreak, with censorship being stepped up, the very approach that experts say helped to accelerate the spread in the first place. Our correspondent, John Sudworth, has more details.
In this message, a medic complains about the quality of protective equipment. The video's now been blocked on the Chinese internet. This one's been taken down too, a daughter crying out for her dead mother. Ever since China silenced Dr. Li Wenliang, who tried to warn about the dangers of the virus and later died from it, the censorship has been increasing.
The WHO asks these questions.
But the World Health Organization insists it's not its place to criticize.
We are epidemiologists, not litigators. We know that the country has identified that there were shortcomings. It is not WHO's role at this stage. Our role is to really help with the positive lessons of moving forward.
In China, focusing on anything other than the positive can be dangerous. This reporter records a few final words before opening the door to the police. Li Zihua was detained, it seems, for trying to report independently about the virus. But now efforts are underway to capture and save some of the censored information.
China is repeating itself back to what happened like during SARS.
One of the anonymous researchers tells me China keeps making the same mistakes. During the SARS virus in 2002, censorship was also rife.
They were trying to hide the information, and that's why people lost lives.
China wants the world to focus not on how censorship may have cost lives, but on the strengths of a system that has now brought the epidemic under control. And the WHO seems to agree.
What do you think of the criticism that China's political and economic clout makes it very difficult for the WHO to criticize?
There is a large epidemic happening. We have seen how, through a concerted national effort at the top level of government, has flattened that epidemic and gained the time for other countries to learn those lessons and not to have to face that same issue.
Some Chinese citizens are unconvinced that anyone should feel grateful for the efforts of the party. A point being made by the professor in this video. It's been blocked. John Sudworth, BBC News, Beijing.
And you can keep up to date with all the developments concerning the coronavirus outbreak, including the symptoms to look out for and lots of background and scientific expertise as well on the BBC News app and on our website bbc.co.
Well, we've had breaking news on the coronavirus outbreak from Italy in the last couple of hours because the government is taking yet more drastic action. The entire country has now been placed under lockdown. Now, we already knew that 15 provinces, primarily in the north, would be under quarantine from Monday morning in order to try and contain the spread of this virus. But by Monday evening, that had been extended to the entire country. Bear in mind, Italy is the worst hit nation outside of China in the world. It has 463 deaths and close to 8,000 infections. Across the next half an hour, we'll bring you up to date from Italy, as well as from the US, Ireland, Israel, Iran, China, the UK, and elsewhere. The state of the crisis more broadly, well, these red graphics here mark where the biggest outbreaks are. There are now over 110,000 cases in more than 110 countries and territories. The death toll is close to 4,000, and more than 60,000 people have recovered. But we're going to begin in Italy in this extended quarantine that's been announced in the last couple of hours. Here's the Prime Minister.
Non ci sarà più una zona rossa.
There won't be a Zone 1 or a Zone 2. There will only be one Italy with a protected zone. We would then need to avoid movements across the whole territory, unless they are essential and motivated by three specific circumstances: work reasons, necessary reasons, or also health reasons. And we add to this decision a prohibition on public gatherings.
So to put this in context, these measures are the most restrictive in Italy since the Second World War. All schools and universities across the country, not just in the north, are going to be shut. Sporting events will be cancelled. Only urgent work or movement because of family reasons will be allowed. And that original isolation area just in the north has now been expanded, but of course it contains Italy's financial hub, Milan. Here's one journalist's account of being there.
I think people are starting to wake up really to what is happening, not only because of the measures that have been taken, but also of the way they were communicated. I think the government is trying to make sure that people shouldn't panic with this, but at the same time, it's really important to be responsible in this moment, and hopefully now people are going to start becoming more responsible and just stay home as much as they can.
Now, not everything is ground to a halt. Some flights are still operating, trains are still running, and to be clear, access to this initially quarantined in the north did not be restricted. It's as though tourists have, despite the variations in restrictions, tourism is worth in the region of, well, 60 million tourists, so many hundreds of millions of euros. So the economic fallout will be considerable. And we know the government's planning to pump billions into the Italian economy in order to deliver a massive shock therapy, to use their phrase. We can't really know if that's going to work for months, though. And as you'd imagine, right now, business owners are concerned.
My mother has a small business 20 minutes away from Milan with one employee and 2 trainees, and she felt that she would have to close her business for a month, and she was worried about her employees. But actually, our local authorities made it pretty clear that business can keep running, but the owner of the business has to guarantee a social distance of 1 meter among clients and visitors.
Well, Italy is a particular concern because of its large elderly population. It has the highest proportion of over 65s in the EU. By that measure, globally, you can see here, Japan has the most elderly population, Italy second, Germany third. And we know older people are by far the most at risk from this coronavirus. They also, of course, have the greatest need for healthcare all round. So we have a double concern. Older people being exposed to the virus and the virus impacting on health service resources more broadly. Here's one Italian virologist.
This is actually the biggest concern that we have at the moment, because intensive care wards are being filled with patients, mainly with elderly people that have a severe respiratory form or a mild respiratory form, and they go to the hospital. And so the semi-intensive and the intensive care units are, they're just full. And what is happening is that they are reprioritizing the activities of the hospital, of the hospitals involved. And this means that patients that had to have other types of surgery or other types of treatment don't have access to that treatment. So it's a very, very difficult situation.
This story is morphing into so many different types of crises. There have now been riots in 27 Italian prisons. The trouble began in the northern city of Modena, where inmates here had been told that personal visits were being suspended because of the virus. Trouble began. 6 people have now died there. We know there was a fire in one cell block. Others died from methadone overdoses after breaking in to the infirmary. If we go a lot further south to Foggia, well, over 50 prisoners escaped to prison there, although 32 have been recaptured. And next, got to look at the situation in San Vittore prison in Milan. Here you can see some inmates right up on the roof. Their banners have been calling for pardons for their crimes and better medical support to protect them from the virus. So 2 quite separate demands there. Outside the prison, their relatives have been joining the protests. So here's one prisoner's wife.
We see that our relatives have nothing. They have no masks, they have no treatment, they have nothing.
And about the situation in these prisons, here's Sofia Bettiza from BBC World Service.
Some riots are still ongoing in the south of Italy, but mostly things have now been contained. We've heard that about 6 people have died as a consequence, and those people that you mentioned, those inmates in the south of Italy, in Foggia, 20 of them are still missing, so they managed to escape.
And is the primary concern of prisoners that they can't be kept safe while this virus is spreading?
It's twofold. That's the main concern, but some of the protests broke out as a consequence of these new measures that you mentioned that have been introduced by the government, meaning that all family visits have been banned. And so inmates were reportedly very angry and started protesting as a consequence of that.
Now, this coronavirus is now testing economies, health systems, prison systems and governments around the world. The number of cases worldwide, well, it's over 110,000. As we've been discussing, the death toll is close to 4,000. But this is not just a health crisis, it's an economic crisis too. Share prices have nosedived today. We've seen the heaviest fall since the financial crisis in 2008. Have a look at the S&P 500. This is what happened when it opened for trading earlier. 500 of the biggest companies in the US down 8% within minutes. You'll see a similar vertical line for the Dow Jones Index. It features 30 of America's biggest companies, down 7%. In fact, prices fell so quickly, trading had to be paused, and when it resumed, there was no let-up. Here's Samir Hussain at the New York Stock Exchange.
The last few weeks have been really dramatic, but really what happened today was something that I had never seen on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Shortly after opening, we saw that the Dow had dropped by almost 2,000 points. It triggered an automatic stop to trading. It's this halt, this sort of safety mechanism that exists on the exchanges, that if there's a drop of 7% or more on the S&P, that the trading will stop for 15 minutes. It gives traders, it gives investors, everyone really an opportunity to sort of stop, to take a breath, to take stock of where they are.
Now here in the UK, the FTSE 100 had a similar story to tell. It represents the 100 biggest companies listed on the London Stock Exchange. It was down its worst day since 2008. Or you could look at the main stock markets for France, Germany, Spain, all down more than 7%. This is Bloomberg's index of 40 companies on the Milan Stock Exchange. Another vertical line, a drop of over 11%. And one of the key drivers for all of this was the price of oil, driven by a standoff between Saudi Arabia, the second biggest oil producer, and Russia, the third biggest oil producer in the world. Now, Saudi Arabia is part of OPEC. That's a grouping of oil-producing countries. OPEC suggested reducing supply because demand has been falling because of the coronavirus. It asked Russia to do the same. Russia refused, so Saudi Arabia refused too, thus creating a glut of crude oil. The Financial Times puts it this way: Saudi Arabia has started a global crude price war, and however you want to define it, this is what happened. Another vertical line. The price of the barrel of oil fell 20% in a matter of minutes. Let's get the view of one analyst.
This is hands out an oil price war. The gauntlet's been thrown, the gloves are off, and that this is going to be the start of something major, and we're starting to see that already. It's a difficult time, and the OPEC deal that unraveled last week was the first step of all of this aftermath that you see today. The Russians have been long resistant to cut supply because they think that high-cost producers should be adjusting supply, not OPEC and Russia. The Saudi Arabia said that they would be willing to extend cuts even through the end of the year, and the Russians refused to allow, and the Saudis won't cut alone. So lo and behold, you had OPEC, the deal unraveling last week, and then you had the Saudi Aramco April barrels being priced over the weekend with significant cuts to their exports.
Well, let's look at how these huge shifts on the oil markets and the stock markets are impacting on people's lives. Here's our economics correspondent, Andrew Walker.
Many people do save directly or indirectly in the stock market. People do buy stakes in investment funds, and also there's their pensions. If you have an occupational pension that's run by your employer, it almost certainly will invest at least some of the money in the stock market. Not exclusively, some of it will invest in company debt, but company shares are a very important part of it. And if you were to have a sustained period of poor performance in the stock market, then the pension fund might have a problem, which it might need to deal with either by reducing the pension benefits that the members get, or by asking for more contributions from the members who are still in work or from their employers.
There may be some people watching thinking, well, okay, it's been a dramatic day, but markets go down, they go up. When would we know if this is actually a slightly more fundamental reset?
I think that's the kind of thing you can only really judge with the benefit of, I'd say, probably several years of hindsight. And I think what will drive it more than anything else is how quickly the world gets on top of this outbreak, and how effective governments and businesses are at containing its economic consequences.
We're going to focus on the United States now. In late February, President Trump told us the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero. That's a good job we've done. Well, those 15 cases haven't gone to zero. The latest figure we have is 607 cases in the US, in 34 states, and in Washington, D.C. too. There have been 22 deaths. Yet the president's been tweeting in the last few hours, the fake news media and their partner, the Democrat Party, is doing everything within its power to inflame the coronavirus situation far beyond what the facts would warrant. Well, as I was mentioning, the facts are there are over 600 confirmed cases. The president also said this when visiting the Centers for Disease Control at the weekend.
I like this stuff. I really get it. People are surprised that I understand it. Every one of these doctors said, how do you know so much about this? Maybe I have a natural ability. Maybe I should have done that instead of running for president.
We'd give a penny for the thoughts of those scientists standing alongside the president. Bear in mind, in this same press conference, President Trump admitted that before the beginning of this COVID-19 crisis, he'd been unaware that people die from the seasonal flu. He also said this about the availability of test kits.
Anybody right now and yesterday, anybody that needs a test gets a test. They're there. They have the tests. And the tests are beautiful. Anybody that needs a test gets a test.
But that's not true. Last week, Vice President Mike Pence says we don't have enough tests to meet what we anticipate will be the demand going forward. Now, federal officials are saying more than 5,000 tests have been conducted, but sometimes one individual requires more than one test, so it doesn't mean that 5,000 people have been tested. A recent tally by The Atlantic magazine estimates that 1,900 people have been tested in America. Just by way of comparison, South Korea is testing 10,000 people every day. We've also had this update from Representative Matt Gaetz saying he's been informed today that he came into contact with a CPAC attendee, this is a Conservative political gathering, 11 days ago, who tested positive for COVID-19. We're told he's now self-quarantining. Bear in mind, this is the same politician who tweeted this last week, mocking people who were worried about the virus. So he's shifted his position a little. Also in the US, there's been an awful lot of attention on this cruise ship, the Grand Princess. Here it is coming under the Golden Gate Bridge. We know there are 21 cases on board out of several thousand passengers and crew. It had been sitting off the Californian coast awaiting instructions since last week, but in the last few hours it has come into the Bay Area and docked. Passengers are now going to be allowed to disembark. We know preparations have been underway for when that happens. They are all going to be going into quarantine. This is one passenger.
So the people that already tested positive will go ashore first, as well as people that are showing symptoms. Then the Californians, which is our group. And after that, I don't know.
All of this is happening despite President Trump saying this yesterday.
Big monster ship that's out there right now, which, again, that's a big decision. Do I want to bring all those people on? People would like me to do that. I don't like the idea of doing it.
He's not keen on the idea, but that's what's happening. If we go in closer on the Bay Area, you can see we've marked the port of Oakland, just across the water from San Francisco. The BBC's Chris Buckler is there.
The ship docked a short time ago, and just behind it, behind me, there are tents set up, there are medical teams waiting, and the whole idea, first Rose, is to get those who are sick with the coronavirus or displaying symptoms off the ship first, specifically to get them to local hospitals to ensure that they get treatment. After that, it's going to be a pretty long process. It's probably going to take a couple of days. They're going to take the Americans off. The Californian residents are going to stay in this state. They're going to go to a military base where they will spend 14 days in quarantine. The other Americans will be taken to military bases in Texas and Georgia. And then there's the whole issue of the international passengers. They will be taken off the ship and they will be taken back to their home countries. Now, some plans are still being made for that.
Well, as well as meeting health officials, President Trump also had what The Hill called a golfing Saturday, and it shared this video from Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach in Florida. And as always with Mr. Trump, there is a tweet from the past to go with this. Here he is in 2014 attacking President Obama. He says there's a major meeting on the Ebola outbreak in New York with people flying from all over the world, but he's decided to play golf. And President Trump, as he often does, decided to play golf this weekend. And that and a whole range of other things means there are quite a few questions about how he's handling this crisis. Here's the New York Times with the headline, "For Trump, coronavirus proves to be an enemy he can't tweet away." Then you have this from Wired. Trump's coronavirus press event was even worse than it looked. Jay Rosen, an academic in the US, says, "After watching the clips, I've just rewatched the entire event. That press conference is one of the nadirs of American democracy, an emergency siren in itself." Or you can read The Atlantic, which says the US isn't ready for what's about to happen. Needless to say, President Trump and his supporters do not buy into that. Earlier, the president simply tweeted, "So much fake news." But on the issue of how he's handling this, here's Chris Buckler again.
What we're seeing are mixed messages coming from senior White House officials, from health officials here in the US, who are saying very clearly, as far as they're concerned, Rose, that people must be very aware of the coronavirus. Yet at the same time, although we've had these visits by President Trump, and you saw up there going to facilities talking about how concerned and how much action is being taken, he then at times seems almost dismissive of the threat of COVID-19. In fact, take a look at another tweet that he said recently. He said, for example, today, nothing is shut down and life and the economy goes on. At this moment, there are 546 confirmed cases of coronavirus. Think about that and comparing it to the number of people who had died from the flu. But of course, the coronavirus is only just spreading. And the reality is the administration has been accused by Democrats of being slow in terms of addressing this. And certainly, I at the weekend was in Seattle and Washington, where there's been a major outbreak. And there is no doubt for people, and particularly in positions of authority there, that they feel it has been slow in getting them resources that they badly need, particularly testing kits.
Now let's take a few minutes to update you on a range of other countries affected by this outbreak. First of all, to Ireland, because the government has cancelled all St Patrick's Day events. There are 21 cases in Ireland so far, but the concerns were if there's an event like this was last year in Dublin, around 500,000 people turned out for the St Patrick's Day parade. These kind of events could help the virus to spread more rapidly. From Ireland, we move to Spain. The government today announced that all schools and universities in Madrid are going to be closed. That will affect more than 1 million students. One of the main outbreaks in the world remains in Iran. The death toll there has gone past 200, but there are major concerns the real figure is much higher. In an effort to fight the spread, Iran's supreme leader has now cancelled a major speech to mark Iranian New Year. That was due to happen later this month. It won't happen anymore. And we've had a tragic example of how misinformation is becoming a huge part of this crisis. More than 30 people have died in Iran from alcohol poisoning after rumours that drinking alcohol would ward off the virus. Next we turn to Israel, which has been announcing updates on its position daily. The government is now saying anyone who comes into the country has to self-isolate for a 14-day period. Well, as we've done every day during this crisis, we've heard from the World Health Organization. Let's get their update today.
Now that the virus has a foothold in so many countries, the threat of a pandemic has become very real. But it would be the first pandemic in history that could be controlled. The bottom line is we're not at the mercy of the virus.
That optimism largely comes from what's happening in China. As you'll know, this is where it began, particularly in Hubei province, and after taking hold in the city of Wuhan, the virus spread very, very quickly, as this graph shows. Through January and February, the number of new cases was growing and growing. But have a look at this in the last few days. The number of cases has pretty much flatlined. Very few new cases. Here's our correspondent, Stephen McDonnell, on how that's happened.
Outside of one city, that's Wuhan, in the rest of China, if you take out people who've come into the country from overseas, have been infected, for 4 days in a row, there have now been 0 extra infections. Now just think about it. That's just like weeks after we had a situation where 80,000 people were infected, and it does seem to show that these quite strict measures being put in place by the Chinese authorities are working in terms of slowing the spread of this disease. You know, apart from locking down Wuhan city, all of Hubei province, 60 million people not able to leave, quarantine provisions in Beijing, where I am, in cities right across the country. And so right now,